So I'm going to introduce you to each of the speakers. They're going to speak for 15 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up for questions. We definitely want to get questions from you. So first up will be Diarmaid Lawlor, who is Head Director of Place Architecture Design Scotland. He's got a background in environmental management and city design for over 20 years. And then in the middle is Claire, who's from Housing LIN. She's the strategic lead for influencing and networks, and comes with a background of over 15 years looking at housing and care situations. And then we have Anne Kim, Director of Health and Wellbeing for IDEO, which is a global design and innovation company. She acted as the Chief Creative Officer for the previous Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who we'll be hearing from later. So I'll ask Diarmaid to kind of run us through the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. My name is Diarmaid, I'm Irish, and I'm the son of a public health nurse. And most of my childhood was dragged in and out of people's houses, whether they wanted or not, or whether I wanted or not. And one of the things I learned most especially about that is the power of contradiction and the power of invitation. When I walked into some people's house at the age of 4, I walked into one woman's house. Her name was Mary Ann. She was 90. She was bedridden. She hadn't moved out of the bed for 10 years. And many people said, wouldn't you be happier, Mary Ann, in a nice care home up the way or in a lovely hospital with a view of the tree? And she said, no. And they said, it'd be really easy. We could move you on. She said, no. And every single day in the local shop adjacent to her, they brought in timber boxes and stacked up the timber boxes in all of the rooms. There was no carpet, no nothing, timber boxes. And they burnt the timber boxes for her in the fire. She had the most powerful set of social connections. She had the most awesome quality of life because she was able to do one thing, which was make a decision about what she wanted to do. This is an image from Venice. Every 2 years there's a Biennale in Venice around architecture. Architects go, nobody else arrives. And this year, Scotland's one was called Happenstance, which is the power of just bumping into people to do stuff. And inside that, we hosted a colloquium on well-being. And in that colloquium, we asked people about these contradictions and choices, and we asked specifically around one thing. Last year, the Director of Education from Ontario came over to talk to us about early years, and he tells a story about a 5-year-old girl who came home to her mammy, and she said, Mammy, the teacher today said I was awesome, so I was. So it was the power of kind of validation. We asked in the colloquium, not what is a good school, not what is a good ways, what is a good architect, whatever. We just asked a kind of simple question. What is the purpose of learning? Whatever, so whatever it is. And a kid said the purpose of learning is to build a sense of agency, to be able to make your choices with confidence in relationships. A 5-year-old gets that, a 15-year-old gets that, a 90-year-old gets that. We're interested in the power of agency. We're particularly interested in how you cultivate the power of agency in the places we already have. Our interest in Scotland is we've got 500 towns. Some of them are a few houses thrown at a ditch. Some are cities. But inside of all of those, small places, big places, there are places of emotional geography and meaning. Our question is, how do we make more of what we already have? And specifically, how do we use that to build a sense of agency? Let's look at a couple of contradictions. Often, designers start by looking at older people in particular around deficit needs. What does Jimmy not have? What can he not do? What is missing? And we also start the discussion around the kind of dependent bit, what their needs are. And recently we were talking with Zoe Ferguson from the Carnegie Foundation, and I said that I was at a workshop recently where a man stood up and said, the only people in my life are paid to be in it. The only people in my life are paid to be in it. And so we talked about what about shifting that towards volunteering, and that would be good, more people in it. And Zoe Ferguson said, what about shifting it to relationships? So we're not just transferring one transaction from paid to volunteering to relationships. And inside that set of things, building on Judith's discussion this morning, what about an anticipatory point of view so we can start off from when somebody is independent, not defined by you, not defined by me, but like Mary Ann, when they're independent and make choices, lifestyle choices, how does the place we have work for independence to dependence, and how does that set of relationships, volunteering, transactions work? We asked a lot of people in Scotland about the idea of the caring place. If the place worked, whatever that means, if the place worked, what difference would that do to the idea of care? And people said that it could do 4 things. So there was a bunch of medical people, caring people, volunteering people, loads of people, not just architects. And they said to do that, you would need to build a sense of. So the idea of place is important. A sense of, one, a sense of place, somewhere that's familiar to me, somewhere that I feel powerful and trusted and confident in, whatever that is. Secondly, a sense of purpose. In that place, there's stuff to do. Thirdly, whether it's my neighbour, whether it's my cousin, whether it's my family I haven't talked to, whether it's whoever, there is support. And finally, touched on by the professor, a sense of worth. Here are 4 phrases. This is the criteria for a caring place. If we were to organise the totality of resources and assets that we had in a place around those 4 criteria, we would think more about collaborative working. We would think more about co-locations. We would think more about purposeful co-production. We're not talking about new fancy stuff. We're just talking about, does the thing you do, whoever you are, do these things? If not, why are we doing it? That's our kind of thing. As you move into that, though, it's quite important to look at the reality of public resources and philanthropic resources, and also just human resources. In the settlements we have 500, some settlements will be independent, everything you need is there. Some will be dependent, you need to go somewhere else. It kind of doesn't matter, because when Marianne opens the door, stuff needs to be there. So at the hyper-local scale, from the door, stuff needs to be there. That runs directly contradictory to a centralising strategy of where we put everything in one place. So some of the things that might be there is it a great place to have a family? Is it a great place to talk? Is it a great place that can support self-directed care? The basics. Second, on hubs, whether it is a hub of services, which might be health-driven or might be well-being driven, where is the hub? What is the hub? It's not necessarily a single building. It's just a meaningful place where you can access the next order of things. And then the next one is the hospital or the specialised bit. Why is this important? Because if place is one of the things we're talking about, if space is the stuff that we're designing, what space is at what scale doing what job? If we mix it up, we tend to build fun hospitals to be. Most people just want to be at home. So if we can kind of look at this hyper-local stuff outside the door, hub, where's the next level of provision, and then onto the hospital. That taps into a Scottish Government agenda which is called realistic medicine, which I think is down here as well, where medics are saying, sometimes we just need somebody to go for a good walk. So it's the prescription of what are the things that will make the difference. It doesn't work. It doesn't work unless you have the conditions in the place to do those things. It's difficult to prescribe a walk when the quality of the walk isn't there. It's difficult to prescribe social contact when the infrastructure to support that isn't there. So our contribution to this is around the social infrastructure that supports it. If we look at the town, so kind of bring it into kind of 4 things. If we look at the town, why is the town or why is the neighbourhood one of the spaces we can look at to do these things? Because it is organised around convenience. Whether its purpose has shifted, the central place, the access, convenience. There's a bunch of spare space, we can get in affordably, we can build the idea of inclusion, and we can do sustainability, all good. The image is Granny's Finest, which is in Rotterdam. So Granny's Finest is where young designers who were full of ideas about design, were very bad at knitting, met some grannies that weren't the best in colour, but were awesome on craft. And the two came together, and it's kind of an intergenerational thing. They ended up creating a digital online business called Granny's Finest, and now it has platformed into a high street shop. So the idea of meaningful work, that sense of purpose, is not just because it's a nice to do. Actually, it can be a productive thing, and it moves both ways. So there's something around the co-production bit. Secondly, on the collaboration bit, this is Macaulay Place in Ireland, actually, where a community of people established around shared norms and then took over an old convent and established a way of living. And interestingly, what is the necessary condition is space that's already there that can be repurposed by starting community first. So that's about collaboration. Thirdly, this is Crocs and Crakes. So it's old people and young people sharing space in a learning setting, but also sharing the curriculum. Not just staying in the same room, but actually the substance of the learning, the process of the learning is moved. And interestingly, this is in North Ayrshire, one of the most deprived parts of Scotland. So we've got co-production around work, we've got collaboration around communities of living, and then we've got co-location around learning. And this is a park in Finland which was established, which has both spaces that are designed to afford a series of activities for older people, whether you're dependent or independent, linked to programs of activities and social contact. So it's a purposeful space, not just an accidental serendipitous kind of thing. It is purposeful, that includes it. All of that stuff there can be easily accommodated in the spaces and towns and bits and pieces we already have. They can easily help us to design a sense of purpose, a sense of worth, a sense of support, and a sense of familiar environments. What's really important in that is not just assuming that they are the right answers, it's to build the conditions for success. The conditions for success is about that difficult thing, honesty, which is saying maybe the contradictions work. So instead of starting off with the best idea, engage in a conversation around what people are after. The diagram is the place standard, which is a tool which has been developed by the NHS and Scottish Government. And the idea of the place standard is to break the dimension of place down into individual components, and it allows a community group to talk coherently and consistently about their priorities and needs. And it takes the same conversation and translate that to service providers. It takes the same conversation and translate that to investment providers. So we can talk differently about what matters, but we've got a shared platform that can carry that conversation across the different pieces. Why is that important? Because it's important that people feel genuinely that the conversation is worthwhile being part of. There is no point in having a conversation if you really don't care about the answer. So participation matters, and this is a tool of effective participation. Secondly, no conversation that we've been in works unless we're honest about the outcomes. Why are we having this chat? What are we going to do? How is that going to move forward? Thirdly, collective leadership is what it means in a place. It's not you, it's not me, it's us. And so that we need a consistent way of looking at that. And finally, the partnership working is important, not because some politician told us to do it or because some civil service said we have to do it because we've got no money. It actually is the root of what the young girl said. My teacher said it was awesome, so I was. That is a partnership between generations, which is about building agency, which is the thing I learned walking in a door in a 90-year-old house. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Claire Skidmore. I work for the Housing Learning and Improvement Network. That's the Housing LIN for short. We're a national network working across England and Wales. We do some work in Scotland as well, bringing together housing, health and care professionals across health, housing and care. So we're really interested in that interface. We have over 25,000 members and growing. It's free to join. And we're really interested in the role of housing and well-being and in physical mental health. That's a key area for us. So I wanted to just highlight some particular risk factors which relate to housing and loneliness. So, just quickly to say, in terms of younger people, I know that's not the focus of this conference, but younger people are at high risk of loneliness. And I just wanted to highlight that increasingly, obviously, young people are unable to afford their own home, and shared houses are often not very sociable places. Increasingly, the shared living area is being turned into a bedroom. So, so actually across all ages, there are challenges. But in terms of older people and also people who provide unpaid care to people in their families and loved ones, there are significant risks in relation to loneliness. And in addition, more and more people are private renting, and there's significant evidence to suggest that people living in private rented homes are particularly at risk of loneliness, to do with a wide range of factors, to do with people not feeling connected to their local community, but also in terms of having to move on frequently. And more older people are living in private rented housing, and there are some interesting demographics around that particular growth in that particular at-risk group. But one way in which loneliness can be tackled is through better housing design and improvements to the housing stock. And that's something I want to explore in my presentation. You may or may not have heard of something called HAPPY, Housing Our Ageing Population Panel for Innovation, which is it's essentially a series of reports that have been published over the last few years. We're on our HAPPY 4 now, our fourth report, highlighting what does good design look like in terms of enabling people in later life to live in good housing, particularly in relation to health and well-being, of which loneliness is clearly a key aspect. And there are 10 key design principles which the Happy panel have recommended. And I think these principles are actually relevant to not just specialist older people's housing, which has been the Happy focus, but actually to all housing and actually to all age groups. I think most of us would identify with these principles. And I wanted to highlight a few of the principles in particular in relation to loneliness. That the importance of balconies and outdoor space, not just in terms of fresh air, but also in terms of actually viewing the world around you, being part of the world around you, encountering other people. The importance of circulation space inside the housing development and shared facilities, hubs and so on, but also outside, so that you have opportunities to naturally bump into other people, as well as for organised activities. And increasingly, older people's housing has been influenced by Happy principles, and you'll see that the developers will advertise their schemes as being conforming to Happy principles. So it has been a real positive, I think, over the last few years in terms of understanding the importance of these benefits. So I wanted to give some specific examples of where really good quality housing can reduce loneliness and improve connection. So there is evidence, really good evidence, that living in good quality retirement housing in later life has a significant impact on reducing loneliness and enabling people to feel more socially connected. And living in a care village, by which I mean independent living in an environment where there's access to care on site, increased life expectancy by up to 5 years. And a lot of that was to do with access to health and wellbeing support, but also to do with community and connection. But it's not just about new housing, it's also about improving the existing housing stock. And again, there's lots of evidence to suggest that fairly kind of practical things, very practical things like repairs and adaptations, improving people's own homes, has a significant impact. The Derby City Council Healthy Housing Hub, which is a really good service, provides a wide range of housing-related services, advice and support, healthy housing assistance, partnership links across the whole city. And there's evaluation to show the positive outcomes for people, which have to do with a whole range of outcomes, but among those are enabling people to make suitable housing choices, so they might not want to stay in their existing home, they might want to move on, which is very hard for a lot of people to kind of make those choices because the information often isn't there. And to ensure that their homes can be adapted to enable a healthy and active life, which could be about getting out, but it could be also about ensuring your home is visitable, that people want to come and visit you in your own home, and that they can do that. Wanted to also highlight some other examples. So there are some really interesting emerging trends in the world of older people's housing, which I think are worthy of reflection for all of us, around co-housing, for example, resident-led and age-friendly communities. I wanted to mention in particular the older women's co-housing development in London, which is very well known and I think much celebrated. And there is evidence and evaluation that suggests that not only were people happy living there, but among the reasons that people were happy living in that development, which has a number of apartments on site with a shared common house where people can cook together, eat together, spend time together, was to do with both informal and formal opportunities for social interaction, everyday mutual support, and also organised activities, yoga. But not just that, outward looking, so not just about those flats, but also inviting people in, inviting the community in and looking outwards. And I wanted to highlight that because actually some of the most lonely people in terms of older people are people who are living in care homes. Not all care homes, some care homes are very good, but very often we see care homes as being quite inward looking, quite off-putting, not necessarily somewhere where you might want to just pop in and say hello. So in terms of outward looking, I wanted to highlight another example, which is Limelight. I don't know if anybody's heard of Limelight, which is an intergenerational housing development in Old Trafford, which is a very deprived area of Manchester, or the Greater Manchester area. And on site, there are a large number of older people's housing flats, but also a health hub, a library, pharmacy, opticians, a nursery, hair and beauty centre, and a cafe. So it has become a real hub for the whole community, and with plenty of opportunity for people to encounter one another, both within that older people's housing community and in the wider area, with lots of activities and events and groups for residents. And I think if we are in any doubt as to the extent to which these ideas are becoming more well known, we might look at the Old People's Home for 4-year-olds. I don't know if anyone watched that last night on Channel 4, which was bringing together older people and children, actually in an extra care housing scheme. So there's so many opportunities for us to do positive things, both in new developments, but also in the existing housing developments that we already live in. I wanted to look at an international example. The Dutch government seems to be taking a very proactive approach. They've invested 26 million euros to fight loneliness among older people, announced earlier this year, with a whole range of measures, including the sort of people angle, looking at volunteers and home visits, but also in terms of looking at neighbourhoods. And from the point of view of this presentation, emphasising the importance of the location of housing. So whether it's a specialist housing scheme, whether it's general mainstream housing, the importance of location in terms of connection to local communities. They're recognising that that's really key, and it's going to be really interesting to see what emerges from that programme. So there are lots of positives, but we face some significant challenges if we're going to sort of, I suppose, extend all of these developments at scale. And some of the issues that the Housing LIN explores regularly with our members include what scope is there for better planning, commissioning, engaging with planners and providers and funders around capital funding, how to promote happy and extra care housing and AIDS adaptations and so on. What strategies are there in place to actually listen to what older people want? And how can we co-create more inspirational housing choices for older people and ultimately for ourselves, for all of us? The Select Committee on Housing for Older People in February this year came up with a whole range of recommendations that very effectively addressed a lot of those challenges, and it's really worth a look. I won't go through the detail, but it's a very evidence-based report, and I think it pretty much sums up a lot of the sort of best practice recommendations that the Housing LIN would be making. I wanted to highlight a book that's been published by Reba. The Housing LIN supported the content, which pulls together some of the most inspirational examples that I've been talking about, and many, many more. So I just wanted to finish really by kind of highlighting the challenges facing individuals. These examples come from a fantastic report, which I would recommend, by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, entitled Housing and Disabled People, Britain's Hidden Crisis. And there are some really, quite upsetting stories actually in there about the extent to which people are isolated. So there's a person who hasn't left their home for 7 years, apart from hospital visits, not out of choice, but because they live on a second floor with no lift and they can't leave the building. Somebody who can't say goodnight to her own children because her home is inaccessible, she can't get into their bedroom. Many people with mobility difficulties living in unsuitable homes with no access to outside space, far from family and friends, because the home isn't suitably adapted. Many people living in insecure, uncomfortable housing situations where they feel they have no control over their own life. They can't move because there aren't suitable homes for them to move into, and they can't afford the adaptations, and often there isn't enough money in the Disabled Facilities Grant to fund adaptations for people. So how easy for many of us would it be to remain socially active with others if we were faced with these challenges? I would suggest quite challenging. I'll just finish off by saying if you're interested in any of the examples given in this presentation and many, many more, I'd recommend you have a look at our website. All the resources are free, and it was a really good library around all of these issues and best practice examples. And do sign up for our newsletter, which is also free, which has got loads of up-to-date information. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anne. I'm going to be talking about designing third spaces. But before we get into it, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I care about this so much. I actually found my way into design through film. And believe it or not, I actually followed a story for 10 years. And the story is about this woman here, Dr. Suniti Solomon. She actually discovered the first case of HIV in India. And 25 years later, after India actually started making their own affordable drugs, she found that her patients were asking her for help in matchmaking. And so, you know, this was actually not easy. I mean, in India, people face a lot of pressure to marry. You see on the left side, on your right side, you know, a bio data. So the data of a young woman looking for a match, right? And so things like her, you know, her status, her wheatish, good-looking skin. So in addition to all the things that you might be up against around just matchmaking in general, it was hard for HIV-positive singles because of this. Managing my HIV is easy. It's living with the loneliness and stigma that's hard. And this was something that we kept hearing over and over again. And so as I think about this topic, I think about Dr. Solomon and that what she did, in addition to matchmaking her patients as a way to curb the spread of the virus, was also giving them confidence to connect in a world where the patients didn't feel like the world didn't want to connect with them. So with this, let's talk about third spaces. All right, so home is the first space, work is the second space, and the third space is sort of the social space, the community space. There was an urban sociologist, Ray Oldenburg, who actually sort of brought this term to the fore. He called it actually third places, and argues that it's essential to community life. It's essential to democracy to have these spaces. And so as you think about, as I was looking out actually after talking to Anne about this talk and thinking about what are the third spaces that exist today? You know, we have your digital third spaces like Instagram. You have, you know, art installations, for instance, one of my favorites is James Terrell here, where, you know, the awe actually brings people together in this way. You have places like McDonald's, actually, right, that are serving as cafes and places where people can actually come and congregate. And places, for instance, where there's Wi-Fi, right, things that people may not have easy access to in their home environment. The example actually down, you see it says music library there. This is actually something really interesting that brands are starting to do, right? So this is Samsung actually in Seoul, where real estate, having extra space in the home is very hard to come by. And so creating these third spaces that are inviting become actually part of a strategic part of their brand of engaging with customers. So in this case, it's actually the music library. It's 10,000 records, vinyls from around the world where people can go in as a customer and go in and check it out and sort of just go in and listen, right? Finding actual calm spaces that people can go to be able to do that, connecting with yourself, connecting with others. We also have, this is a little photo of a cafe called the Third Space Cafe that I actually found in Colorado. You have religious spaces. You also have, this is a very random photo, the spam there, that's actually our internal IDEO web ring that we created. So these are some websites and some designers had created, again, as sort of a virtual third space as a way of getting to know each other. But as I think about this, as a designer, I'm thinking about what is the connection that we're trying to help foster, right? It's one thing to create a space. It's another thing to design it with intention to help really think about, are we trying to get people to talk across the political spectrum? Are we trying to get people who are extremely lonely out of their loneliness? Are we trying to get people to connect with themselves, right? So these are the kinds of questions that go through my mind as I think about these spaces. So 4 quick examples on this. 1, so policing is a very big issue in the United States, and you know, one of the biggest issues with this is the different ways in which people are treated. Some people are profiled, other people are patrolled, vastly different. Huge problem in New York City, and so we actually at IDEO had worked with the New York Civil Liberties Union to get people engaged on it. They knew that they wanted a campaign, but the question was, how do we actually get people engaged on this topic, which is really hard to talk about and frankly very isolating. And so what we did was we actually, if you go to look at the lower right, we started looking around for inspiration. And one of the places we found inspiration was actually the living room. And so we took a very cheap way to prototype this, which is essentially like a paper background, some foam core, some tables, as a way to explore how do we get people, strangers, all residents of New York, to talk about this. What we ended up designing was this thing called the listening room. So these were pop-up, essentially pop-up conversations spaces that were taken out to all the different boroughs of New York. The one you see here is actually right in front of Yankee Stadium. And so, this was an invitation in for people, strangers, to come and talk about their policing experiences. As part of the design, I think it's really important to think about, well, what are the assets that we're creating as we think about these third spaces and encouraging? In the same way that Anne actually gave you all a prompt to discuss, sort of move closer. Similarly here, we were just thinking about ways that we could actually promote this conversation. So having conversation cards, different scenarios that people would go through, right? Should police be in charge of school discipline? Safety in my community means blank. So creating the scaffolding for that conversation to happen was incredibly important for people to actually be able to connect. Strategically speaking, what they're trying to do is actually connect all these disparate stories from around the city, put this essentially into a storytelling sort of modality, and then send it to the mayor, as well as a lot of other agencies, right? So how do you collect these assets, right? And thinking about the sense of purpose, giving people a sense of purpose to participate. So a question for you all, how might we design spaces for listening? Because I believe that listening is as important as conversation. Second example, the gold portal. So has anybody seen this? No, okay. So the gold portal came out a few years ago, designed by a young man who actually worked as a journalist and was inspired by his grandmother who had come from Pakistan and moved, I believe, to the US. And she wanted to know how her country had changed. She didn't want to get it through the news reports. She wanted to see herself how it had changed. And so, fast forward through many years of iteration, what the concept essentially are these gold portals, 20 throughout the world, where conversation times are set up so that a portal, say, in this forest could actually be connected to the portal in Iraq, right? And I point this out as a way of thinking about technology. I often think of technology, social media, isolation, competition, comparison. But I think there are ways to explore technology beyond just thinking about social media. So in this case, I point out the technology here where they very clearly made a decision to create these sort of private portals where you're walking into another world. The projection, it's an audio immersive space. The projection is life-size, so you're not looking at a miniature version of the person on the other side. You are looking at a life-size version of this person. They describe it as the internet that you can walk through, which I think is really wonderful. And so the stories that come out of this are really amazing in terms of what it enables. You see people dancing. There's one guy who talked about how he realized that, a guy in LA who realized that he shared in common with somebody in Afghanistan a love of Justin Bieber. So talking about, having real conversation here on the left side of a violin teacher in Colorado actually connecting with somebody in Rwanda to teach violin. And then on the lower right side, the gentleman you see there, Lewis Lee, he actually is part of their design is actually having these curators. So he's a curator for the portal in Chicago. And he had done this because he wanted to establish this outside of his daughter's school so kids would stay out of trouble. And what he found was that the community started rallying around the space. And for him personally, as somebody who had experienced violence as a young man, he'd been shot 5 times when he was 18, it turned out that he was actually able to connect with people living in war zones like Afghanistan and Syria, and actually find through that connection, through that acknowledgement of sort of a very deep personal experience, find the kind of connection that is really meaningful. And I think they do this brilliant thing where actually on the theme of the gold, they have these gold notes that people leave behind. And I was reading some of these, and it was really wonderful what sort of came out of this. What a great way to feel connected to the people you hear about in the news every day. My favorite one actually is intimate, awkward, human, blessed, right? There is an awkwardness to connection sometimes that I think this really beautifully designs with. Opening your soul and your thoughts to another human being. I feel like this is really the goal of these third spaces that we can design with a lot of intentionality. So how might we design spaces that actually shrink that distance? Third example here. In the United States, so at IDEO, we also work with startups. And in thinking about digital examples, this one was one that came to mind. So MyDR is a platform. It's a video game platform that helps kids with big emotions. So think ADHD or anger management challenges to actually learn that regulation through video games. And so the way that, just very quickly in terms of how it works, you wear a Heartrate Monitor. As you play the video game, there's a little gear there that tells you how excited you are. And so as you're playing the game, if you get too excited, these little clouds start appearing. And what the kids are taught to do is actually to learn self-breathing, right, as a way to regulate their emotion. And it's really amazing, actually. It reduces outbursts by 62%, oppositional behavior by 40%. If you can imagine what the cascading effect is, right? These are kids who are probably isolated, right? Because they can't play with other kids, and so they play this game, and so they're able to, and this is a really important theme in thinking about digital tools around connection, is take what they've learned digitally and bring it offline, bring it into the physical world. But as we were doing the work, one of the things that was really interesting was the experience of the parents. The parents are incredibly isolated, right? In the United States, there's not a great healthcare system. And you know, a lot of these parents are have tried and explored all these different options around the current mental health system, and many of them are very desperate and feel very isolated. And so what we did in designing this video game, which actually became a platform for connection, was ways for parents to connect with each other. So this image doesn't quite capture it, but creating what the team at IDEO recognized is that this was a platform to create connection between parents, between coaches who were certified to be able to help them through and coach not only in terms of using the game, but actually just sort of moving through the world. And so through this service, it sort of ballooned into this really amazing third space that actually has a ton of impact and is growing very excitedly. So how might we design spaces that create belonging? I think that sense of belonging is something that's so intrinsic and so important, because it's through the act of listening that you acknowledge, and through the acknowledgement that you create that sense of belonging. Fourth example, and this is a very brief one. So I've had the privilege, or our studio's had the privilege of working with the new Minister of Happiness and Wellbeing in the UAE. Has anybody come across this in their work? Okay. So the work is in progress, but what I wanted to point out here was that part of what we were doing in partnership with that office was traveling around the 7 Emirates of the UAE to figure out, well, what exactly is the narrative around well-being? And overwhelmingly, the thing that kept coming up over and over again was a sense of connection. Right? It was actually really astonishing that, you know, in the rapid development of the UAE, they've gone from from traditional ways of life in literally 1.5 generations to just amazing wealth. And you can imagine the advantages that come with that, and the anxiety and the disconnection that comes with that as well. But what was really touching to me about it was the act of building a narrative as a kind of third space, right? So while this work is still in progress, I think that you know, if we can think about narrative itself and building that together, I mean, you're hearing themes around co-designing, right, around listening to people, but that building that narrative together is in fact a kind of third space. And when you build physical third spaces, I really believe that you need to have the narrative third space as well, right? That those two things really marry together to create something that will be impactful ultimately. So my fourth challenge is, how might we use narratives as a third space? So, you know, my personal fascination with this really is that third spaces enable different types of connection. And we heard some of that this morning from Julianne. But I think thinking about the connection itself, which I think people are very hungry for, I mean, it's part of the reason why I think this whole sort of movement around mindfulness and pausing is incredibly important. The connection to others, especially, I speak as an American where we're particularly, you know, people are in very separate camps. It's really hard to find middle ground to have meaningful conversations about this, but also connection to our community and our wider world. And I think through developing third spaces like this, that we can really tap into our sense of purpose as humans and get back, you know, to thinking about, I know Julianne was talking about how sort of a biological, right, need around connection. And so third spaces, I really believe, can help enable that. So just as a last thought, just in terms of Dr. Solomon, the power of connection here. So 10 years later, she makes lots of matches. What's really incredible about this is that not only did she see the stress levels of patients go down, they also had increased levels of CD4 counts, so with the white blood cells in our bodies. And so that manifestation of connection physically, physiologically, the ability literally for her patients to live longer is something that stays with me. And I hope as all of you go forward and think about the ways that you can design for space, draw from some of the experience in terms of what keeps you motivated in battling loneliness. So with that, I hope we can go forward and connect.
So thank you very much to all the speakers. I'm going to open it up to the floor. We've got a microphone here. There's someone down here.
Hi, my name is Michelle Dawson. I manage Ageing Better Middlesbrough. I spoke to our mayor recently around age-friendly communities and buildings. Middlesbrough's going through a lot of physical regeneration, followed by some social regeneration. And I asked him what the chances were of an age-friendly communities agenda, so thousands of older people who we've connected with being able to influence the way that buildings and infrastructure is designed locally. And what he said, which I suppose I'm asking you, is this your experience? How much of a barrier or a challenge is this when you're creating new buildings and spaces in places? What he said is that 10 years ago, a lot of builders, designers, had to be heavily influenced by things like accessibility, whether or not buildings were right for everybody in the community or just being kind of chucked up regardless, and that was massively on the minds of people designing and building. And that in the last 10 years, pretty much the government generally turns the other way now, and so without the stick to be able to hold people accountable for the way that they design spaces, that's gone. And so it's much harder to get developers and builders to consider different populations in building, because even local authorities or the people in charge don't really have anything to hit them over the head with if they don't. Is that a challenge? Is that a real issue? It's not my bag. I work in social care. But basically, he said the chances of us being able to influence any of those things were pretty much zero.
I disagree.
Can everyone hear people on the stage?
Yeah, so I don't disagree that it's difficult, but I disagree with the fundamental principle that we can't do anything. So there are 3 stages of influence around building. One is, what is the purpose for which we require a building? So before we build a building, what is it that we're trying to do that a building's the answer? So if it's around relationships, we've just heard 4 alternative ways of fostering relationships. That might be a much better use of money. So the first conversation, pre-construction, is around purpose. That conversation is a leadership conversation, and that sits with the population, with the directors of service, and with the elected members. So part of what makes an effective conversation is not to start focusing on how quick are we going to build a building and who's going to do it. It's to focus on the outcomes, so an outcome-driven thing. And that might sound like a lot of chat, but if it's a school, what is the purpose of a school? If it's a hospital, what's the purpose of it? It's not an off-the-shelf thing. What is it? Second area of influence is at the briefing stage. So it's moving from the leadership chat into the briefing, where we can use levers like legislation. We can use levers like procurement. We can use levers like the appointment and quality criteria for design. We can use peer feedback to ask and insist, but also to follow up on how things are going to be done. And the third one is activism. So as the building is going through the process of planning and building control, citizens still have the opportunity to say, I object. So there's 3 different levels of influence. 1, leadership. Why do you need this? Second, now that you've decided you need it, what is it you need to do? And thirdly, now that you're building it, what is the opportunity for people to still engage? It's important to be clear on the different spaces, but it's more important not to accept that there is no influence. That's not correct.
I think just to, I would agree with what you said. I think we would agree in the sense that it has become much more challenging over the last 10 years. There have been some backward steps. That said, there are still levers, there are still opportunities, and there are places that are doing it better than others. And so that's where we focus our work. So we will look at where are people doing this really well, where are there opportunities to influence. So just a couple of examples. So the Select Committee inquiry that I referenced has some really good recommendations in there. And some of those recommendations are for government, but some of them are for local authorities and for planners. So there definitely are things that can be done at a local level still to improve local planning, for example. Sorry, is that me? There are local authorities where planners are making use of the fact that public health are in local authorities in England now, and there are opportunities for those conversations which perhaps wouldn't have happened before. The other example I would give is the Healthy New Towns, which we're working with the government and a whole range of other partners on developing the guidance following that, and that is very much going to be talking about relevant sort of outcomes. What the levers will be to influence developers to do that. It is challenging, but it's an ongoing, it's an ongoing area that we're all working to influence. And I do think that there are opportunities. If you want some good examples, there are lots of examples on the Housing LIN website of where people are managing to make real progress in the area you mentioned.
Great, thanks for that question. Any other questions? Yep, this lady in blue.
Hiya, I'm Sarah from Nesta. I was just interested in, because I appreciate that some of the ideas about buildings are incredible, but where I live on a housing estate that was built in the 1860s, and I'm just interested in any kind of, I guess, almost kind of cheap and easy things that communities can do themselves to try and increase the connections within those areas, because I think the buildings where I live, I mean, they're very old, and the adaptations are kind of, yeah, I mean, the City West Housing are looking at doing some of the work, but I just wondered, as far as kind of just trying to improve the environment, if there's things that people can, or ideas that you guys have seen that people can kind of do themselves rather than waiting for all this kind of bureaucracy to come down.
Yeah, I guess so there's two spaces in that. One is the external space outside of the house and in the wider neighbourhood. So last year we funded a programme in Scotland called Stole Spaces. So it was spaces in between development. It might have been that there was no developer there since 1860, but so that what they provided an opportunity was for communities to take a meanwhile lease in it. You know, so an interim, a year, 6 months, 2 weeks, whatever. And they could host a conversation about what they wanted to do, and there were tools and strategies available that was fast, that was quick, and that was around their needs. And probably the most powerful one that I can reference is in a relatively poor town where they used it as an opportunity to create photographs of the life of the place. So just people like you doing stuff on a derelict toilet. And on the day that they were mounting the exhibition, a young fella in school, like a 15-year-old, who might go this way to success or that way to the opposite, met a young kid from college, you know, and a college photographer, and the kid was putting the photographs on the wall badly, and the 15-year-old thought, I could do that. So that moment allowed a young person to say, I could make a transformationally different choice, enabled by just whacking things onto a wall. So one is the outdoor space, and I think that's incredibly important. The other one is the internal space. So within estates, it often came with the social space or the community space, and sometimes they've been well loved and sometimes they haven't. And I think there are great opportunities to adapt the program of the space, the activities within the space, but also drawing on some of the IDEO stuff to create a different identity for it. So to create a happy, wonderful place, which is momentary, as opposed to a capital investment thing, which is permanent. So I think the outdoor space, it's fast, it's effective, it's open, it is contingent on clarity around the timing, but that really works from an intergenerational point. And then also on the social spaces, programming and identity.
Clarity.
I was just going to say that in many communities, housing providers are playing quite an active role in some of the kind of objectives you're talking about. I was just reading about Bromford housing provider. I mean, many housing providers have sheltered housing stock, which is really quite tired and, you know, not very aspirational, but very often still have communal space that hasn't always been, as you said, hasn't always been well loved, but provides a real asset. And Bromford are doing some really interesting work. It's worth looking up the Bromford Innovation Lab. They're doing some really interesting work in communities and enabling co-creation. The other housing provider I'd mention is the South Yorkshire Housing Association, which has a co-create arm, which is all about enabling communities to create solutions, and not just in their own housing stock, but in the communities where their housing stock sits. So there are some good examples where that can be done together.
Is there any international example that you'd want to?
And, well, actually, I was thinking about speaking to something else around your question, which is, if you think about time and how, I mean, architecture projects, those projects take a lot of time. And so in design, when you're designing, whether it's a service or, you know, we work a lot in hospitals, which are, they move very slowly. And so this idea, just building off what you were saying, prototyping different experiences, reclaiming this space, just the act in that in and of itself is really powerful. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. But I think, I would prototype and think, well, what will bring community together with the goal of sort of reclaiming the space and ultimately, hopefully, improving it. But I think that sort of the residents' emotional connection to the space is something that you can really design for using the surfaces that you have right now without too much cost. Yeah.
There was the lady in red. I'm not going to start singing a Christy Ray song. Sorry about that.
Hi, actually this follows on really nicely from the lady said. I'm the founder of the Friendly Bench. It's a project I created myself, and basically it's a curbside community parklets to connect people right on their doorstep. So everything you're saying, my heart is beating out my chest. I'm so excited about what you're saying. One thing that we've noticed, we're located nearby a local housing authorities independent living, and although they have got the communal space and they come and go as they please, what they've really loved about the Friendly Bench is that we've enabled their community to connect with the community that they're based in. Neither two connected. The community around them didn't feel that they could go in their communal space. The people in the communal space didn't feel that they belonged. So this has just been a really nice intervention on their doorstep that has brought these two communities together. So you mentioned the intergenerational and the communal spaces within the complex. Do you find that that can actually encourage external communities to come in, or does it still revolve around those that are in that locality?
I visited the Extra Care Charitable Trust Extra Care Housing Scheme in Birmingham, which is on the old Longbridge site. It's completely regenerated that community alongside a number of other developments with it. And that scheme has been built from the outset with the understanding that it was an asset of the community, not just the people that live there. And they have a weekly market in their central indoor space where people can come in and, it's the market, but it's in their building. There's Tai Chi, yoga, all sorts of things, and people are coming and going all the time. And I think some older sheltered housing schemes have challenges where residents feel that it's their space and it has to be carefully managed. I think where it's easier with new schemes because it can be, that expectation can be built in from the outset. But I just wanted to say, in terms of it sounds like a fantastic project, in terms of the outside space, I think it's really important to think about the practical design as well as the kind of design for enabling social interaction for all of us. If you are disabled and the streets aren't designed to be accessible, then that is a very isolating experience for you, even if, in terms of the general public, it's a lovely space. So that's something that we also really, when we're working with the government on the Healthy New Towns, we keep kind of saying, please remember accessibility. It's really important if you want everybody to feel equally welcome and able to use those spaces. So just, yeah.
There's one report I would kind of maybe point you towards. It was the Carnegie Trust did a report called The Place of Kindness. And it was a really, I think, quite a groundbreaking report because it looked at the attachment that people have to certain spaces and that people have to have an affiliation or affinity with it. And you've got to acknowledge that, and you've got to look at how people use space already before you can actually look at sort of evolving it sort of out from there. So go where people are to start with and then build out from there. There was someone just up there and then we'll come back down.
I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but I've got something around the protection of third spaces, and I work in mental health, and our organisation works with people with learning disabilities as well, and we're finding that a lot of the community centres, a lot of the places where people felt comfortable in public libraries are closing, and people have access to choices about where they're spending their time or activities that they're going to, or places that are familiar or that feel safe for people to visit. So choice around third space is becoming very limited. And I guess, I just thought then, when I was quite inspired by the IDEO presentation as well, around how maybe something around how third spaces that are more internet-based could be helping protect the third spaces that we have in the community, and by different client groups or across client groups. Don't know.
Yeah, you know, in some of the research that we've done around third spaces just comes up a lot, actually, regardless of project. And there is a similar thing in the U.S. where there aren't as many third spaces anymore, you know. And so it's interesting seeing how some of these other businesses and services are actually picking up on this, right, and intentionally creating those spaces. On the point of online third spaces, I think that's totally a space that's to be explored. I think the sort of golden portal is a great example of that. I'm curious to see where this is going to take us. But with the digital space, I think there has to be an element of something that feels physical, and that's why the golden portal feels so smart, is because of the scale at which they're doing this, right? And so I'm curious to see where things will go in that vein. But I think people are starting to feel too confined, actually, on sort of the social media platforms that we have now. And so as we think about sort of expanding that into those spaces, it's going to be something around the physical, digital sort of tethering together that I think is going to be sort of the sweet spot. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm excited by what's out there.
I just pick on that. I think if as a local authority or a health board, we're really interested in outcomes, properly interested in outcomes, as opposed to the financial efficiency of the building or the accountancy efficiency of a kind of commissioning thing, I think that does start to bring us towards categorization of different types of space. A default would be to centralize everything into one place and build a rhetoric that everything's there, it's the best thing for you. But around your mental health kind of point of view, the scaffolding of one safe space to the next safe space to the next safe space. See that kind of language of scaffolding and purposeful space. We need to articulate that more so that people are able to make informed decisions rather than defaulting to what appears to be the best decision. And I think around the scaffolding bit, we might be able to repurpose spaces we have in schools, the foyers of hospitals. When we're commissioning new large civic buildings, we might purposefully insist that a proportion of that space is a third space. So we might look at repurposing what we have, but also setting a criteria in the neighbourhood or the town that all future public investment, however you see that, must have a dimension of third space, and that it needs to connect. And back to your point around the bench, the evidence from the Schools for the Future programme in England, actually, and in UK, has been when we've put too much focus on central collaborative spaces, you know, kind of mixed spaces, we reduce choice. And when we reduce choice, we start to raise catastrophic stressors around well-being. We need sloppy spaces, we need informal spaces, but we need to position that argument strategically.
I think we've only got time for one more question. I'm really sorry. There was a lady down here with red hair who'd... Sorry.
Very daintily given, thank you very much. It's not a question, I just want to share something that we're doing. My name's Anne Osborne and I run the Rural Coffee Caravan in Suffolk, which is a charity dealing with rural isolation. And we've recently started an initiative called Meet Up Mondays, where we've been asking the pub or the hospitality business to get involved. And it's very specifically to be the business, not a village hall, not a church hall, but a pub or a cafe. And if, in effect, they run a free coffee morning on a Monday. And it's just taken off. It's growing like topsy. We've got 40 now in Suffolk. In fact, we've got one in County Antrim, and one in Worthing as well. But people are coming together in the pub or in the cafe, and the feedback constantly is how important it is for them to be out in real life. This is the term that they're using. And we've had people tell us that it's actually been life-changing and that they are now coming back into the pub or the cafe at other times because they've got the confidence to do it. And really interestingly, these are people who don't have the confidence to go to the village hall because they expect it to be cliquey. And on the other side of it, because they're going back into these businesses, particularly in rural areas, it's helping the sustainability of those businesses, which in turn helps the people in the location to keep that possibly one remaining asset that they have. So if anybody wants to know any more about that, then I'm here.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we're out of time. It's just because the minister is coming back and you'll probably want to kind of dash to the loo and get a cup of water. No? No, not allowed. Not allowed. Okay. So thank you so much to all the speakers, to Diarmaid, to Claire, and to Anne. I know there was much more questions. I mean, this issue is one actually we could run an entire day's conference on because there's so many different sort of elements to it. If you've got any burning questions, I mean that in a good way, around this issue, if you want to kind of put them down on a kind of post-it and kind of give them to me, I can see if there's a way of us at some point kind of feeding back as part of the kind of conference, because I saw a kind of a wave of hands sort of near the end. Just because I'm interested, could people just shout out some of the spaces that you last connected with a stranger at, just to kind of give us a sense of where things were in the room? Bus stop? Station? Train? Platform? Waitrose?
Job club.
Job club? Their house. Oh, okay. Did you know them?
No.
Long story. Let's come back to that story later. Much, much later. That'll be the evening portion of it. What other spaces? School playgrounds. Okay. A queue. Yeah. Great. The showers. There's so much I could say to that, but I'm just going to have to rein it back in. The what, sorry? No, just do you go for it? Okay. There's a whole story. Coffee shop? Okay. So these are some of the kind of third spaces, really. It's the ad hoc spaces. So please go and read the Carnegie report, because I think it really speaks to a lot of that kind of sloppy space stuff that we're talking about. So again, thank you so much. We'll be waiting for the minister to come in. We're staying in here. So I'd ask you to give a little bit of applause for the speakers.